Model level validation is a common requirement to perform model level validation. This is usually done by sprinkling some attributes on top of your class library that contains your field elements within your model, such as name, last name, email, and so forth. These are such to perform basic validation logic based on multiple properties. You can use compare attribute that provides a limited version of this. For unlimited validation logic, you want to use the iValidateObject interface and its validate method. Client and server-side validation is pretty good in MVC4. All the validation seen so far has just been client-side. This is data that is validated in the client browser without posting back to a server. MVC creates client-side JavaScript code to make this happen. This should never be used alone. It's too easy to hack. Client-side validation requirements are: it must be turned on, which is by default. All the views must have references to jQuery and jQuery validation libraries. And server-side validation can only be used with the validation summary HTML helper. This uses the model state is valid that returns a bool. So combining both of these, you really have a strong validation presence in MVC4. In this demo, we're going to be looking at basic validation by way MVC prefers to use it, which is using the model and having some data annotations such as required in range, for instance, as the data annotations for the ID, and as well as required in string length for the name. Now these are data annotations that are very popular in MVC and the preferred way of doing your validation, because it's in one place that you can set it along with your model regardless of how many times or where your model is used throughout your web application. So one of the many benefits of separating the concerns of the model's views and controllers in an MVC application is that each of the three components is able to contain all of the code of which it's concerned. This means, for example, that the view is only concerned with the user interface and contains only the code that displays the page and the data to the user. It doesn't have any business logic, data access, or any other code unrelated to the user interface. So this is where and why we put data annotations within the model, such as required, range, and so forth. Beyond those data type sort of requirements, you may also have business logic that requires an email address to be of a format that meets the requirements of the internet, or so that no customer can receive more than 5 orders a year with greater than 20% discount. All of these data and business logic rules are in place to ensure that the stored data is of the highest quality and that the application doesn't allow any violations of the rules by means of the way the business operates. So this is why we need to really focus on the model of MVC and sprinkle our data annotations within the model itself so that we don't have custom erroring on one page for the same model item opposed to another page that's using the same model, but yet we want a different data annotation required for it. Anyways, so here is the model. We've got a few requirements here. We've got string length for the name. For the age, we do have a range set between 0 and 20 for a dog, which is kind of standard. Some dogs live to be more than 20, but for right now, we'll just keep it at 20. So this is our model, and let's go ahead and run our application. Control F5 and do dog list, and we'll go ahead and say create new. And without filling anything in, I'm just going to hit create. So what we have here is our validation summary running, which is here. Get our view up so you can see the create view here. So we have our validation summary, and then we have our validation message, which is bound to our model field, and we have that throughout here. So back in our page here, here's our validation summary, and here are the validation messages that are showing up, and the highlighting, which is nice, which is supplied by the styling of the MVC template and the unobtrusive JavaScript automatically highlights some of these things for us. Again, even with the radio buttons and the age. Although the drop-down lists don't get highlighted like the others do, but as long as you have the validation message, which could be just an asterisk if you are displaying all the errors or all the fields up top with the validation summary. Or you can have it like this, where you actually just display the actual error. So let's go ahead and fill in some of the information here. So I'll just call our new dog. We'll just call him Tester, and say it's a male, and we'll give him an age of, we'll say he's 25 years old. He's an extremely old dog. And we'll just test there. Hit create again. Okay, so now it's done a post back to the server, and our server-side validation says, hey, this must be between 0 and 20 because we put in 25. Where this error is coming from, even though we have data in there, we have a separate data annotation for the range, which we have specified in our dog model, which is right here. We're saying the range for a dog has to be between 0 and 20, otherwise it's going to spit out this error message of must be between 0 and 20. So that has allowed this other error to be flagged here, so we have to change this. Say, oh, actually he's not 25, he's 19. We hit create, and then here's our new dog. So this is an example of how to correctly use data annotations for some simple server-side validation within MVC. In this demo, we're going to be looking at client-side validation, which, while similar to server-side validation, in terms of it uses the same model class as the server-side does to do its validation. This is actually executed on the server-side via JavaScript that gets created with a lot of the data-val HTML5 attributes that get sprinkled within the input elements within a view page. So here we have the dog model again, as we were used all along. We have a couple required, couple ranges. We have a string length here for name, and a couple other fields that have some data annotations to it. So one of the things about doing client-side validation in MVC4 versus server-side is that you have to make sure that there's a couple other things set up in MVC4 to make sure that your JavaScript or jQuery validation is available. Otherwise, it won't work, and your server-side validation will be your safety net, if you will, and the only thing that actually will work. So one of the first things we want to do to make sure that we can use client-side validation here is we want to check out our web config and to make sure that a couple things are enabled. So here we have two keys in the app settings. One's client validation enabled, that's set to true, and we also have unobtrusive JavaScript enabled, also set to true. Now these two come default with the MVC4 template, but if you are upgrading from MVC3 or before to a MVC4, you need to make sure that you add these particular keys in there. Otherwise, it may not work for you, and you won't have client validation. So now that we know that those are set, we can close our web config. Then in our Solution Explorer, we need to go check our bundle config, which again, this is part of MVC4. In our bundle config, we specify JavaScript files and CSS files with the intention of minification and obfuscation when we push these to production. So here we have a bundle that's titled jQuery val for validation, and it's pulling in two JavaScript files for jQuery unobtrusive and the jQuery validate. So now that we know that we have a bundle set up for our jQuery validation, we need to go to our master page or our layout page and make sure that we're calling the jQuery val so we can have access to these jQuery libraries. So let's go ahead and close the bundle config, go to our Solution Explorer, open up our layout, and scroll down to the bottom. Okay, here we go. So now we're just calling jQuery so that right now, even though we have other things set up, without the jQuery validation libraries available to us, our client-side validation will not work correctly. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. Make sure we get those validation libraries in. Okay, so that is part of our setup there. Okay, so now we should be good to go. Let's get our create view open. Make sure our form's correct. Let's look at our controller quickly. And we're going to be doing our create. Okay. So there is that list. So let's go ahead and run this. We'll go into our dog list. We're going to do create new. And just for a name, I'm just going to type in, this is a super duper long name. Now as soon as I leave the focus of this field, it should have client-side validation, which it does. I just tabbed out of it, and what this did is it fired the string length data annotation saying the name could be no longer than 15 characters, and that is coming from our dog model here. Here's our name, and here's the string length, and here's it saying that name can be no longer than 15 characters. So that's where that shows up. So let's change his name to text, and as soon as I tab out, it's okay. And yes, he's a male. I'll say that, actually, you know what? I'm just not going to fill in anything else. So without even posting back, you see that it fired the ages required validation, and is also required for the handedness for me to choose one. So I'll choose that. Dog name text needs to be a guy, because I selected male there. So let's do this. If I say he's 25, you notice right away, as soon as I got done putting in my numbers, it automatically fired the range attribute for the age, which was right here, saying it needs to be 0 and 20. So the client-side validation is very, very handy, because this prevents a lot of frustrated people filling out a big form, hitting a button, only to be told that they did something incorrect like halfway down the form. So let me go ahead and correct this to 20. And you notice, as soon as I put in something that it liked, the validation went away. So if I say, oh, I didn't mean 200, I meant 20, the validation goes away. So this is what makes client-side validation really, really cool and a great user experience for your end users. So what if we had some validation that needs to be done, say a female that gets neutered? Now if you know anything about animals, females don't get neutered, they get spayed. So if I try to do this, hopefully our validation runs, and this is the server-side validation that would run, because client-side can't handle that part. And that validation is done at the bottom of our dog model, where we have a validate rule, where we say a spayed and gender equal male, then a male dog cannot be spayed. And here we say a female dog can't be neutered. So this is an example of using client-side validation, and if for whatever reason you need to turn off client-side validation site-wide, it's actually not too bad. You can simply come into your web config, where we have client validation enabled, and you can just turn this to false. So by saving that and rerunning it, we should be able to go back into our create page and type in and not see client validation at all. So that's kind of a handy feature if you do need to force server-side posts back with validation within MVC. One thing to note though is that it is probably a better practice to have a combination of client-side and server-side validation, but you don't need everything every which way. Like for instance, you don't need to always validate client-side and then turn around and validate that again on server-side if you don't need to, but it is good practice to have both in place, especially server-side code, because if you only have client-side, somebody can write their own form and post to the same controller, and if you don't have server-side validation doing any kind of checks and balances, you can have somebody simply bypass any security you have from just having client-side validation. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind when you're setting up validation for your MVC site.